Hi guys, my name is Geneviève. Thanks for tuning in to this demo of our latest release of Harmony, which is version 17. For the purpose of the specific demo, we'll be looking at Harmony Premium specifically, but know that we have 3 different versions of Harmony. So we've got Premium, Advanced, and Essentials, which are basically versions that will help you kind of ramp up your way to the full version of Harmony Premium. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to open up the software right here and connect as work offline. So over here we've got the scene creation process. So we are going to create our file just by inserting the name. I'll just call this one Demo 17, and you find the location of your file. And here you've got camera size with height. So you're basically setting the size of your scene. So if you want it to be 4K, if you want it to be HDTV, this is where you put it. I'm going to create my scene right away. And one thing that's good to know is that in Harmony, you can work with either vector or bitmap images. That means bitmap is kind of closer to what you would see, let's say, on other softwares like Photoshop. You're really kind of drawing on a canvas. Now, I actually have a pretty good example for this that I'm going to bring in right now. Let's look at the different types of line and artwork that we've got on here. So we've got bitmap. Currently, I've separated my line from my color. So bitmap is a specific type that when you zoom in too close, you'll start seeing the pixels over here, as with a lot of other drawing softwares. But it also allows you to have more texture variation in the style that you're looking for. Now, moving on to another type that we've got the vector brush. Now, vector is kind of it's kind of like this weird science where you get a mathematical curve that is going to follow your drawing here. So if I trace something over here, I can actually go into my editing tools and move around parts of the lines and a couple of points here to get the shape and aspect that I want for my line. Now you can see that we can also color these lines. Now this is a possibility whether you're working with bitmap or vector. We're going to move on to textured vector brush. Now this is an interesting one because we are actually taking both technologies and combining them together. In this one here, if I go into my editing tools, we zoom in closer and we see that we get that nice textured look to really kind of feel like it's closer to hand-drawn. But we also have the vector contour around it. This means that I can still go and edit parts of my line if I want to make it thicker, or if I want to change the direction that part of my lines are going, and really come and edit those to get the look that I want. Now, going into the pencil. Pencil is a little bit different than the brush. Now, if I go into my drawing over here and select my line, I'll notice that instead of having a vector contour around my strokes here, I've actually got an interior line that allows me to select the points, move around these things that we call Béziers, and really allow you to reshape very easily your line. And this pencil over here kind of has like a hard vector line. Vector meaning that we're not going to get pixelization even if we zoom in really close. We're going to get a nice crisp line to our drawings. And the alternative to using pencil if you want to have texture is just our very next option over here, textured pencil. Now, if I zoom in a little bit closer, again, we are merging both technologies, bitmap and vector, to be able to have a nice little texture. And what's kind of cool about the pencil, actually, is that even if your shape is already drawn, you can go and grab your select tool, lasso around this. And if I go into my tool properties, I can come and change the type of texture that I have. So if I want to have something more chalky, or grab even something completely different like this one here, we can do that. Another thing that's pretty cool about the pencil is that if you, for some reason, have a camera that moves you really far away or very close to your character, and you want to thicken the lines that you've got here, you can do that with the pencil. Make it larger, make it thinner, and so on. Really, these are all the drawing tools that we can use for your animation, whether you have, anime style, Disney style, we've got it all covered right here. All right, so we're still talking about drawing tools, but this time I'm going to show you guys a new feature that's included in Harmony 17, the pen settings toolbar. So it's this toolbar right here. You've got a couple of different settings that you have. By default, your stabilizer over here should be set to off. And what this is used for is for kind of getting a bit more stable hand when you draw. So if you're like me and sometimes you have a bit of a shaky grasp on your pen and you don't feel so comfortable, either cleaning up a drawing or something like that, you are probably going to love this feature. So I've imported a drawing over here that's a little bit rough, that needs cleaning up. So one thing that's good to know is that with this new tool, you can use either the brush or the pencil along with all the other tools that we've seen so far, all the other features. And over here, I've got two options for the stabilizer. I can have it set to average. Now, average is going to help me draw, and the line kind of drags a little bit behind as I draw. You might be able to see it. I'll put it to a setting that's a bit more extreme so that you guys can have a pretty good idea. We see that the line is actually chasing after my pen. Now, this is actually setting an average to remove like any little bumps that I have in my hand if I'm a little bit unsteady. So it can help for some really smooth lines, but it's a little bit harder to get some nice sharp angles. If you want to get that, you're probably better off going with the pulled string here. So kind of as the name says it, you have right next to your pen here, you're pretty much tugging at the string that's gonna trace the line that you want to follow. So if I put it again a bit more extreme, we can definitely see that if I don't tug far enough, the pen doesn't start drawing right away. But if I want an angle, I can just switch over to the other side and trace. And now I get a nice smooth line. And again, as I said, this works with both the pencil and the brush, whether you're using texture or not. Now, another thing that we can find inside this toolbar is this little button here. This is the pen pressure feel. It's not gonna necessarily show so much as I show you guys on here, but it's something that you can really feel when you're adjusting this curve. So basically we can see the output percentage, the input pressure percentage, and now I'm gonna get a lot more details in the smaller, thinner parts of my drawing and less control over the larger parts. If I wanted to get something a bit more even, I would again put it back the way that we had it before. But sometimes when you want to get a lot of control over finer details, you can go something like this and then have a lot of control, and you really need to push down hard to get a nice thick line. So really great for whenever you're working on those details. Okay, so we're gonna get back to the drawing tools in just a little bit, but for now, let's remove this and keep going. So what do we want when we start working on a scene? Usually we're gonna start from a storyboard. So I'm gonna bring one in over here just so we can see what's the plan for our animation. So I'm gonna make this a little bit longer so we can get the full scene. And we've got it right here. So I can give that a play real quick and bring in my playback toolbar. Let's have a look. Our characters stop walking. Okay, so we've talked about a bit about character drawings. Now let's talk about the layouts and the backgrounds that we are going to put inside of our scene. I've got my storyboard right here. What I'm using right now is the node view. We'll talk about that a little bit later. I'm just kind of using it to get my structure inside of my scene. And for backgrounds, sometimes it really depends on what you want to use. We allow for bringing in PSDs or any other image. Over here, if you go File, Import, Images, you've got plenty of options over here to bring in external files that you can put directly into the software. We also allow, obviously, for creating your own backgrounds into Harmony. And you can get something that resembles this. We're just going to deactivate the storyboard real quick and come back to the beginning of our scene. So I've imported my background. And looking at it just like this, it looks pretty much the same as it did on the other image that I had before. So we've got all of our different layers. We can actually import them as separate images. And we can actually see those over here in our timeline. And one interesting thing that you can actually do when importing these images is actually put a little bit of distance between these layers. So some of you may be familiar with the term multiplane camera. So this is what's happening here. So I've taken each of these layers and distanced them a little bit. And it still kind of looks the same this way, but let's have a look into our perspective view over here to see what's going on. We've got all of our layers kind of split like this. And the magic really happens when you import a camera and start adding motion to your scene. So from the node library over here, I've just brought in a camera, and I'm going to create what we call a peg on top of it. So a peg is essentially a little node that will allow you to have movement on something. So whether it's your camera, a background, a character, anything really. From this camera, I'm going to go back to my timeline here, and I'm going to set down a keyframe on the first frame and just zoom in around frame 60. So let's see what we get. So we can really feel the depth happening inside this image here. And now easily like that, we can just turn the motion on these keyframes and get a nice little pan. Let's again do a little playback over here. And we've got our zoom in just like that. So for this background, as I've mentioned before, I've used assets that were imported into the software from a Photoshop file. Now, if we wanted to do these layouts and backgrounds into Harmony directly, we could do a slightly different thing that we're going to look at right now. So I'm going to go back into my library over here and import these beautiful BGs. These backgrounds here were created directly into Harmony using one of my favorite features, personally, called the guides. So the guides are their own view that you can actually find in the drop-down over here. By default, it doesn't really change anything right now, but if we want, we can actually press on the plus here to import all sorts of guides. So we've got 1-point perspective, 2-point perspective, bird's eye view, worm's eye view, you name it. And ever since Harmony 17 released, we've got even more to offer with those. We've got 4-point continuous perspective, 4-point perspective vertical pan, fisheye perspective, even isometric perspective for all of you gamers out there. This is definitely one that's used very often. Right now, I'm just going to go and import the guides for this particular background. You can actually export and re-import your guides if you want to reuse them in other scenes that you've got here. So for this particular background, we've used a couple of different guides, and you'll only see the guides when you go into your drawing tools. So again, brush or pencil, whichever you like. Okay, so I'm just going to select my brush. You can use either the brush or the pencil to do these. And as soon as I go into my drawing tools, you can see that we've got these pointed lines happening. And these are taking place across my drawing here. If we zoom out even more, this is a pretty big BG, but you can see we've got all of these lines over here kind of guiding me. This is one of the new ones. We've got curvy linear perspective. And don't worry, it's much easier to use than it is to say curvy linear. So we can actually position our horizon line over here. We can rotate it. We can see the degrees over here in the upper right corner. You can move it around as well from the center point over here, scale it from the corners, and really come and position it so that it matches the type of perspective that you want to have. Now, I'm just going to go back to the one I had for using with this perspective. And because I've got my guide already inside the scene, I can actually go and update, add to it, and really kind of just follow these lines here. So if I wanted to add more stuff in the structure, and just keep adding to it like that, you can really easily turn off the guides as well if you need to have like curvy lines, and then just reactivate them from this button to keep adding to it. I'm going to show you another type of perspective. We're going to, again, bring in another guide. This one is going to be the fisheye. All right, here we go. So we've got our fisheye perspective over here. Again, another new feature that was added into the tools that we've got. We can actually see that the lines on this perspective are curved from top to bottom, and as well as from left to right. So again, really easy to go and just position your drawing. You can actually see from the pointed line where this is going to end up. We just trace our line exactly where it has to be according to the perspective that you've chosen. And here we go. All right, we're going to get rid of this, and I'm going to go back into my library. I haven't really mentioned much about the library just yet. The library is pretty much a place that gives you access to any file on your computer. So really handy if you want to just drag in some TPL, which are essentially templates that you can create from the software, or even images, your PSDs, like I mentioned. You can open any folder from your computer onto this and get really quick and easy access to make your work process a whole lot faster. Now, let's go ahead and continue with the storyboard that we had. And we are going to import our first steps of paperless animation. So also known as hand-drawn, so really frame-by-frame animation that was created for this. Just going to bring this here, and we've got our storyboard in the back. I'm just going to check, I'm just going to select part of my animation here. Let's take the girl and we'll go into our drawing tools. So when you are creating your rough animation, what do you start with? Usually you're going to start from your key poses to make sure that you have the bulk of your animation just right. So over here, I've actually marked some of my keys as different colors. And this is something that you can do from the Mark drawing toolbar over here. So assigning whether it's a keyframe, a breakdown. So I've actually just marked some of these over here. And this can be tremendously helpful when combined with other features, such as the onion skin, which is pretty much an essential for paperless animation. So if I keep to my brush tool, I'll just go and bring up my onion skin over here. And when I turn this on, this actually makes these little handles right to the side of my playhead appear. I can actually extend those to show more drawings or retract them. And green is basically showing me what's after my playhead, and red is showing me what comes before. So usually not the kind of thing where I want to show too many drawings, but pretty handy for going to trace. I'm actually just going to deactivate my storyboard so we can see a little bit better what's going on here. So I would go frame by frame and trace all of these different poses over here to create my rough animation. If I need a little bit more control over my onion skin, I can actually open up the advanced onion skin view. So we've got this over here. Remember what I was saying about Mark drawings being able to collaborate with certain other features? Well, we've got one right here that allows us to show us only the keys, only the breakdowns, or maybe both, like this, to really kind of isolate certain poses and focus on the work without being distracted by everything else that's going on. Because we know there's a lot going on very often in animation. Okay, other than that, in the onion skin, you can also choose to show certain drawings or frames and reduce the opacity of the onion skin if it's a little bit too distracting for you. Now, once we've got our rough animation, we're ready to move on to the clean animation of our characters. So I'm actually going to just get rid of these for now, and we'll import our clean version of our characters. Okay, so now we've got our clean version, and we've actually got the characters colored over here as well. So for the cleanup, I can use, again, my onion skin over here to go and trace, whether I decide to use brush, pencil, texture, you name it. You can really pick and choose depending on the style that you want. And if I go into my drawing over here, and this is something that you may have noticed initially when I was showing the drawing tools, but we can see that we only see the line art. There's a particular reason for that. We prefer in general to split the line from the color so that if we need to update one or the other, we actually have that capacity instead of undoing work. So we really don't want to backtrack on that end because there's just so many drawings. So in this one over here, we've actually got these layers over on the side called the art layers. So we've got 4 of those, 4 per drawing. I like to think of it kind of as a celluloid. Basically, you've got your line on one layer, you've got your color directly under to make sure that everything appears nice and smooth, the animation. So line is over here. We've got color underneath it. And you can actually see that blue stroke surrounding the color. Obviously, going to manually go and paint all of the edges of your drawings would take a little while to do, especially on a drawing per drawing situation. So we don't necessarily want that to happen. So this is why we've got additional options, such as transferring the line over into the color art as an invisible stroke. And then you can go and paint using the different paint tools that we've got here. We've got paint, paint unpainted, which is great for filling out a lot of areas that are left unpainted. And especially in the tool properties, we've also got a lot of interesting features such as the close gap, because when you're working with vector, Sometimes you will have situations where you've got little creases in the line, and when you try to fill those up, if they're not closed properly, might not work so well. And this is like a typical vector thing, but with the auto close gap, you'll be able to have your full drawings completely painted. As we can see here, if I wanted to go into my color, I've got the opportunity to go and paint each of these with the colors that I want. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about color. Harmony has its own unique way of managing palettes, and you'll see it's very, very handy, especially when you want to modify colors on an entire scene. So the way that I have them set up over here is I have two sections in my color view. We've got this upper section where the palettes are stored. We call them palettes. Essentially, each of these has different color pots within them. And let's say if I want to use the palette of my corgi character over here, I can actually just go and color pick to make sure that I'm using the right one. And we've got all of the colors used for that character inside that one palette. Now, when I want to adjust the colors for my character a little bit over here, I've actually got all of these different colors. If I double click on them, I can actually go and check which colors we've got in that specific pot. If I want the RGB, I've even got gradients, as you can see over here, so I can move around these different colors. I could choose to make it bright green for some reason, or make a green corgi, and it changes directly as I do it inside of not only this drawing, but all of the other drawings on my character as well, as you can see. So if I keep moving through the timeline, all of these are changed because there is a specific color ID within each of these color pots that allows me to link them directly to it. So it's really easy to go and make these changes. Now, what else could we do with something like this, potentially? I'll just go back to the previous color of my character. Because the palettes are set up this way, we could just as easily right-click on a palette and decide to do something like, let's say, cloning it. By cloning it, I'm creating a different version of this palette, but that still holds the same color ID. So that means I could potentially have something like a night palette. I'll just press this here, and we'll bring this palette up so that we don't lose it. And now if I wanted to edit the colors inside this palette, I could do it manually. Or another thing I could do is simply go into the menu over here, palette, and I've got tint panel, which I find really handy for coming to modify multiple colors at the same time. So I really just have to select all of these at the same time. And I will choose blending, kind of like blending a couple of colors over here. We can see that the colors are changing. If we want to get a preview on the character, we can just hit this little box here, and we can see that the colors are changing. We could double click on this box here. Maybe if it's night, we'll want something a bit more purple. And once we're happy with the result, we just press apply, and now our palette is officially modified. So if we want to see the difference between both of these palettes, I could just bring my other one above here, and we could alternate between the two. We could even have our character transitioning from a night scene to a day scene or vice versa. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so I'm going to move away from paperless animation a little bit and go into a little bit of cutout animation. So when we are talking about cutout animation, what are we talking about exactly? Some people are going to call it puppet animation. We're talking about really taking a character And as brutal as it seems, we're going to break it down into pieces. So I will import these two characters over here. We actually had a fun little concept for this project where we have the girl and dog redesigned by multiple contributors, including studios. This one was made by Australian studio 12 Field. And over here, instead of having the whole drawing a part of a single layer, we have the upper arm, lower arm, the eye, the pupil. Anything that needs to move needs to be on its own layer. So we'll then be able to move these individually using a little something we saw earlier called pegs. And we'll be able to create rotation like this. And the fun thing about these is that these can be actually interpolated from one pose to the other. So I could have another keyframe over here, simply turn the motion on, and I'll just get the arm raising up like this and automatically animated between the two poses. Now, obviously, animators will work a little bit harder to achieve something that looks really good. So we can actually have multiple systems in here to recreate a puppet that is going to be able to sometimes even move as smoothly as paperless animation. So we're just going to move into the node view over here because very often rigging will occur for the most part inside the node view. Optimal rigging is very often done inside the node view over here. So we've got a lot of systems over here using different nodes. Like we can see over here, we've got the head, the cheek, back cheek, the ear, and so on. So each of these pieces have a peg on top of it, so they can all be animated. Not only can we animate each piece individually, but we can also create them in a hierarchy that allows us to, let's say, select the head. And I can move up the hierarchy to select the full head, the neck, the body, and then just keep going like this to really have the full hierarchy of our character. And the same goes with every limb and the body following the natural order of things. Basically, hand is going to be attached to the forearm and so on. Now, there's a couple of things that really have improved the way that rigging and cutout animation behaves over time. One of these changes that came back a couple of versions ago, around Harmony 9, if I believe. So we've come a long way since. Okay, so deformers are going to behave a little bit like pegs, but definitely more advanced. So instead of getting a big blocky movement like this, you'll be able to add from the deformation toolbar that you can add over here. I'm just going to slide this over here, and we've got this rigging tool that allows us to create deformers. So I'm going to show you guys here just one deformer to see how this could look. This is a curved deformer, and it really allows me to get like a bendy feel out of my arm. So I can really come and position it, and we get a nice smooth curve as opposed to a very robotic kind of movement. So that's pretty neat. We can put some on the hair as well if I want to get pieces that are a lot more bendy, a lot more fluid. We have a couple of types of deformers. You can see one of them here. Another one is the bone deformer. You've got one over here on the torso. This one looks a little bit different. As you can see, it allows me to bend with rotation part of the body over here. And we've got two more types of deformers. I'm actually saving those for later. All right, so there's actually a lot of variety in the different types of cutout characters that you can get. You can go very simple or very complex. Ideally, You have to kind of make your way to that complexity before attempting this type of rig. But this is one of the examples of the more complex rigs where we can have all these different types of angles and various expressions as well that you can get in your characters. One of the types of deformers that we are using very often in these advanced rigs is called an envelope deformer. So pretty much as the name says it, you're putting an envelope around a certain shape. So we've got over here one of these types of deformers that allows me to move these points around, perhaps reduce the Béziers on here. And of course, as with any other deformer or pegs or any of these motion and transformation nodes that we've got into the software, we are talking about nodes that can be animated and interpolated between two keys. So these types of deformers come very handy for organic shapes that you want to move, let's say something like the hair that we've got here. And these have always worked great in the past, but there was one thing that was really hard to achieve, and those were textures, especially textures that you had inside a shape. Those would not necessarily work so great with an envelope, something like this, for instance. Now, luckily, in Harmony 17, we do have a new type of deformer that is making its grand entrance into the deformers that we currently have. So I'm just going to go into my tool properties over here to show you guys. So we had curve, envelope, we've got bone over here that we've already seen. The new one is actually over here called Freeform Deformer. So we can actually click on this with the shape that we want selected. We'll just make sure that we have our texture selected over here. You can actually find it on our node view over here. And on this one here, selecting my texture, going back into my rigging tool, and I'll show you just how easy it is to set it up. And it's the case with any deformer, actually. So don't let them scare you. They're really fun to work with, really easy, and definitely a great asset for any animator to have. So I'm just clicking, creating points on the four corners of my image, and I'm going to add an extra one in the center here. I feel like that would definitely help me control the middle part here if I want to bend it. So you can always come and edit these later. This is actually when I see my deformers as red, this means that I'm in the editing mode. If I go back to my transform tool, we can see that these now become green, meaning that we're in the animation mode. So we can actually move these around and get a nice little bit of motion over here happening. We can squeeze these, pinch the texture a bit more, and it all works really nicely. So we could choose to add some more by going back in here. If I wanted to add one at the bottom, perhaps to bring this one down a little. So you can really see how easy it is. It took 5 seconds to set up, no more than that, and you've got yourself a nice distorted texture that you can animate freely on all of your different poses. From this point on, I could actually choose to then cut this texture by the sweater. This is a nice little feature that we've got here. The cutter, we use that very often for a lot of different things in rigging, but also in paperless animation. Anytime you need to create a mask, right now we're masking the pattern with the shape of the sweater. We could mask pupils by the shape of the eye and so on. So there's a lot of that happening in the software. Okay, so we're going to talk just a little bit about one type of nodes that we've got into the software that can definitely be helpful for setting up more complex, more advanced rigs. These are called constraints. We've got them in the node library over here as their own little menu. Constraints. We've got a couple ones here. I want to talk a little bit about the 2-point constraint. Really helpful little node that you can set up on things like the legs, let's say. I'm going to go and find my leg here. And these are the darker nodes. We've got 2-point constraints. And these will help me create what probably comes closest to a setup called IKs. So inverse kinematic, basically. You're then able to, instead of moving from the usual hierarchy, so from the boot and moving up, you can move the other way around. So if you need your character to bend down, you could actually take the entire setup. I'm going to move up the hierarchy, and we can keep the feet grounded by doing something like this. So something that was usually very difficult to achieve, and even more so from a quadruped point of view. So we can actually select the dog, move it around, and just kind of have a nice bounce to it as well, because there's a little bit of stretch and squash happening in that node, all of which we can customize over here in those settings. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the master controller next. So the master controller we have had in previous version. It was actually introduced in Harmony 15, but it's grown a lot since. And especially with this new version in Harmony 17, we're making it easier than ever for you guys to be able to incorporate it into your rigs. So in this scene over here, I've already got a couple of poses set up. As you can see, I've got multiple head angles that we've got here. And I'm going to show you guys a quick preview of how we can set up these different types of master controllers. So in Harmony 16, we used to have 2 different types. We had the slider and the grid. So I can actually show you guys over here. I'll select my character and go into my master controller toolbar, which I'll bring over here. And we'll just click over here to make a couple of master controllers visible. Now this is a new option to just really easily make them all visible at the same time, or maybe just some that stay hidden. So we've got 2 different types over here. We've got the sliders that we can see over here on the right. Some of them have different colors. And we've got this little square with the point in the center. Now, the slider allows me to take some poses and assign them to a vertical or horizontal slider, like let's say a blink. So I can actually have my character blinking. Now, this isn't some magic trick or anything. We've actually just applied some deformers to the eyelids and to the eye and gradually made it close. And we just assign these poses to the slider so that they're available at all times for the animators to access. We could also make some separate ones, like this one here. And we've also made one over here for the mouth. Now we've also got another type of master controller. This is the grid master controller. So this allows me to assign the poses that I've created and make them move around to really follow the point that we've got here. Now this is definitely very handy for posing out your animated scenes and really creating quick and efficient and also on model poses. So because this is all set up ahead of time and this will be given to the animators before they start their animation, everything in this puppet is accessible to the animators so that they can use it. All right, so one of the things that used to be a little bit harder to achieve with the previous master controller was to kind of combine both the slider and the grid together. So let's say if I had the position of my grid over here and I would move the slider, it would kind of pop back into its original location because both keys would come into conflict. So we've got a solution for that in Harmony 17. We are introducing the master controller stack wizard. So this will allow us to use in the toolbar up here a combination of both wizards that we had previously. So before we could set up the grid using this button over here, and we would assign each pose to these different little circles that we've got here. Now we can actually use this new one. We're just going to go and grab the head of our character over here. And I've already preset up the poses so that this is going to work. So we have the full head rotation with the mouth closed. For this option here, I'm going to be using the open and closed mouth as an example. We've got the open mouth in every angle, as well as the O mouth in every angle over here. So we're going to be using those for setting up our new stack wizard. So I'm going to go over here and click on the stack wizard to open up the grid over here. The green points means that we've already got some points assigned to it. So we'll just load a preset that I've already created of this. So same setup as for the grid wizard over here. We are assigning each pose. So we can see the frame number in here. So 21, 22, and so on. And we've got the slider over here on the right side that allows us to select pose 1, which is actually associated with my closed mouth. Pose 2, which is associated with my open mouth. If I actually click on these points, you'll be able to see which pose is assigned. So top row is actually looking up, middle, and down, as we can see here. And moving into my third pose, this is my O mouth, and we've got looking up, middle, down. So I'm just going to keep associating these last 3 poses. I'm going to move those to the side over here and just try to see over here which one we need to associate. So we've got looking up, quarter front. It's going to be this one here. I'm going to move here and this last one over here. So at this point, it's really just assigning the poses to the frames that we want, and we'll simply go and name it. We'll call it just stack for now. Create, and we'll just go and connect it to perhaps our top composite here, just so we can find it easily. And we're simply going to close that. So this creates a node. So as you can see, the master controller is actually a node that you can reach into. And this is associated to a script. Now, when you create it, you can actually see the new master controller that you've created. I will just really quickly hide these other ones so that we can see just the one that we've created. Now you can see that it's actually down here. If we want to move it up, same as with anything else, we can actually just add a peg on top of it and simply move it up here. Now, as we can see, we've got the grid, but we've also got a slider on the side. So that means I can move around my different poses like so, and then use the slider to get the pose that I want. So I had 3 different slider positions, 3 different mouth positions as well. And we can use those on any view that we've got to interpolate really properly. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about animation now. So we've set up our puppets. We've already created all of our characters and everything. We can actually import our characters into our animated scenes to then start moving. I've got over here a couple of characters that we've seen previously that are actually animated. So we can get a preview of both our characters over here doing a run cycle. And they are using, obviously, the techniques that we've spoken about previously. They are using deformers. They are using different pegs and constraints so that we really get the full motion that we want to be able to reach and the full quality that we want to have with our animation. Now, one of the things that you can do with your animation tools is access the Animate Onion Skin range, which I find is a really interesting tool if you want to just make a quick fix on a specific part of your animation. Let's say this arm is not exactly where I want it to be. I can actually select this. And when I'm using this option here, as the name says, Animate Onion Skin range, this means that it will take only the parts that are within my onion skin to adjust them. So I could make this arm a little bit higher, and it will take all the poses that are contained within this range and animate only these ones and repositions those specific keyframes. So as we can see, now the arm is actually moving a little bit higher up as opposed to the other instances of my run cycle. Now, another thing that you may have noticed when I was working on the master controller was that we have a brand new way to mark keyframes or really anything within the timeline. You can actually right-click on any space within your timeline here, and you have the option now to mark frame. So this is really handy for animators, especially I find, if you want to set your key poses, you know, when you're doing your posing initially, and you would go and perhaps mark that specific frame or go to this one as your next key pose over here. So these markers that you're setting down, these are not keyframe specific. You're really assigning a color. You can pick if your keyframes are going to be blue and your in-betweens are going to be green, or really, it's really just you assigning a color to a frame. All right, we're going to be focusing a little bit more on compositing now. So a lot of people will use a variety of different softwares to do their compositing. Harmony is actually the full package. It can take you from step A to step Z, and you really get a final product once you finish your entire scene, including the compositing. Now, you've seen the node library a little bit before. We've got a lot of different things in here. So all of these here are effects and different nodes that you can use for compositing. So we've talked a little bit about the cutter before. We've talked about the constraints. So there's some movement happening there. We've also got a lot of other effects, and I'm going to walk you guys through a couple of them. So we were talking about making a full scene. So let's make it a full scene. I'm going to re-import my background into my setup over here. And currently we've only got our character running on the spot here. So I've actually created a peg here to make her run from point A to B. Here we go. So she's actually crossing across the screen. We've got our camera over here that is framing the entire thing. And over here, I might want to add a bit more effects onto my characters. One of them that often happens inside a scene like this is obviously have a shadow on the ground where my character is. Now, depending on the style of the show, sometimes you're going to get like the puddle shadow happening under the character. You could easily add one of those in and just track it with the same peg to follow the movement of the character. But I want to take it a notch further. I'm actually going to go into my node library here and show you guys the shadow node over here. So the shadow node, if I drag this in, so any node that you find here can be brought in here. So if I look at the girl and I connect the shadow underneath the girl here, let's see what happens. So we can actually see that the girl becomes a shadow. Sometimes I have to go in render view to see the final look of these effects. So I'm just going to click on that blue flower here and select render view. And we can see what's happening with our character. She becomes literally a shadow. So we don't necessarily want that. We'd actually want the shadow to be sitting under her. So instead of doing that, we would probably connect the character over the shadow, just like so. And I've actually got a pretty good example of a pre-made shadow over here. And we're also using a couple of different nodes. I'm going to keep the current one. We've got the applied peg transformation. This is actually one that's used very much in compositing because it allows you to take the character and offset it a little bit by a certain amount to not have to manually go and redraw the shadows in the shape of the character. So a great time saver for sure. Now we want to use the girl, but slightly offset. So we're going to take the connection that we had previously to the shadow, and we are going to attach to this little port here, the transformation port, a little something we call a quad map. So the quad map allows us to offset the character. So we can actually see what it's doing over here if I grow or set a bit of perspective down on our character and position it so that the feet connect together, just like so. And we can also see, especially if we go in our render view, that we've got the shape of our character. Not only that, but it's also going to follow as our character keeps on running. So we can actually see the different poses over here. Now with the shadow node, obviously you have a bit more control than just straight the position that we've applied over here. If we look into the settings, we can change the intensity of the shadow, the alpha, the color. If I wanted to get something very colorful, I could go in here, change the alpha, make it darker, and so on. So we've got a nice tainted shadow over here. Probably not the best compositing I've ever done in my life. Obviously, it's going to be a little more discreet, but for the purpose of showing you guys what we can do, we'll just leave it like that. Okay. So one thing that people often want to do in their scene to really take it to the next level is to add highlights and tones to their characters. So I've actually got one set up right here. I'm just going to drag it in. And this white node that you see, this is actually a group. So just like with the characters that we've got here, groups are very handy for keeping your node view in control and not exploding with too much information, basically. But also for, when you create these little effects templates, they're really easy to go and reuse later on by just copying them, snapping them under another character, and reusing them. So I'm just going to insert this one in here. And let's go and look inside of our group. So we see the familiar apply peg transformation that we've used previously for the shadow. And we're doing pretty much the same thing over here. We are offsetting the character to create an area of shadow that kind of retains the information and does basically a shadow that's a little bit more dynamic than just, a full gradient on the character. Again, with these ones, you've got a lot of different options. You've got the blur radius over here if you want hard shadows or more blurry. Sometimes blurry will fit certain shows a little bit more. And you can also change the color. Let's go with a purple to match our previous shadow that we had inside the scene. So we can get that to add to here. And we've also got the highlight on the other side here. We can see it a little bit on the hair, on the arm as well, to really get a bit more depth onto your character. Now, if we wanted to go a little bit crazy, we could keep adding to those character. I'm just going to talk about two of the nodes that I often use inside my scene. We've got the color override, which allows us to extract a color from either a character or a drawing. And we can simply connect it above our character. So I'm already extracting from this one the eye fill color from the corgi, and we could add yet another effect node like the glow here and really get a wacky, crazy animal over there. So you can really get any type of effect that you want within Harmony. We've got particle systems as well. We don't have time to show everything, obviously, because there's just so much. But I definitely encourage you guys to check it out more in the documentation and on our Learn portal, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Okay, we're going to talk about just a couple more things. We're going to talk about two of our latest features in Harmony 17. And so I'm going to import this scene here. Okay, so we've got yet another animated cycle over here with the dog and girl. And what we've got here in terms of new features is two things. We've got a brand new motion blur. So we used to have a motion blur before inside of Harmony, but now it's more performant than ever. I'm going to insert over here. We've got our brand new motion blur node. I'm going to put it onto my two characters over here, and we're going to go again in render view to see what this is going to look like. So if I go into my layer properties, I've got a couple of options here. We can choose the samples per frame. So basically, the more samples you have, the higher definition your blur is going to be. If I set this to 3, we can actually see the blur instances that we've got, and these become much more layered and much more visible. And the more we layer them together, and the higher the number, the more efficient the blur is going to be. So you can get a really cool blur. All of these features that we saw in the layer property here can be animated through time. So if you need your blur to be really extreme at one point and fade away entirely, you can do that. Now, another feature that we've added in is the RGB difference keyer. What does that do? Basically, when you have green screen footage that you want to incorporate into your animated scene, you can simply import your footage over here. We can actually see it in the library. I'm going to connect it at the very top here so we can see what we get. We've got an effect of a paintbrush kind of showing up here and fitting the entire camera. So we basically want this effect to kind of paint away the background. So I'm going to use the effect over here, and it's actually really simple to use. You only have to go and open up your layer properties over here. And just to be able to see it, I'll connect it over here. And we would simply go and double click on there and color pick the green so that it gets removed from the current footage that we're using. So let's have a look in render view what happens in here. When I use this one, I'm going to use this to cut away my background. So we can see what's going on here. Our background is slowly getting erased by the green screen footage that we had previously. So let's have a look at what the final result is with our very last feature that I'm going to show you guys. We can export to different formats that we've got here. You can see animated GIF. You've got export to movie, obviously. And recently we've added MP4 to the list of export formats that we can have. So we're just going to pick that one, choose the resolution, number of frames, and I've already got the exported file over here. Let's open that up. And here we have it. So we hope that you guys have enjoyed this presentation. If you want to know more about these features, be sure to check out our website, toonboom.com. You can also find plenty of documentation on these features, current and previous features that we had prior to Harmony 17, obviously on docs.toonboom.com. And I encourage you to check out also our Learn portal at learn.toonboom.com. There you'll find plenty of tutorials on anything that you want. If you're a new user, go ahead and check it out. You can also download a free trial on there.